when history goes quiet, the hours between what survived. History usually introduces itself loudly. Dates, names, arrows pointing forward with confidence. It likes to pretend it remembers everything. But late at night, that confidence softens. The edges blur. And if you listen closely enough, the story begins to admit something uncomfortable. Most of it is missing. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you are welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue without interruption. There is nothing you need to do right now. Now rest. This is not a lesson. It is a pause. We grow up believing history is a long hallway lined with labeled doors. Open one and you find a war. Open another and there is an invention. Everything feels arranged. But that hallway is an illusion. In reality, most of the doors were never labeled. Many were burned. Some were never built at all. What survives is not a complete record, but a handful of objects that happen to escape fire, water, boredom, and human decisions made in bad moods. Late-night history prefers these gaps, not because they are dramatic, but because they are honest. Silence is often the most accurate witness. Libraries did not only disappear in spectacular disasters, they vanished quietly. Scrolls were reused. Tablets were buried and forgotten. Notes were never written because someone was tired or assumed tomorrow would come. And then tomorrow did not cooperate. There is a certain irony in how much effort we put into reconstructing what people once thought, while barely noticing how easily thought itself evaporates. Entire ways of organizing the world can vanish without leaving a vocabulary behind. When that happens later, generations mistake absence for simplicity. If nothing was written, then surely nothing complex existed. That assumption is comforting. It allows us to feel advanced without earning it. Science walks into these quiet rooms with confidence and very good tools. It measures layers, it dates fragments, it names cultures based on pottery styles and burial patterns, and then it stops, because tools are excellent at measuring matter but terrible at recovering intention. A symbol scratched into clay can be cataloged endlessly, while its meaning remains stubbornly asleep. Sometimes the silence is mistaken for mystery. People lean in too hard and begin filling the gaps with elaborate explanations. Others retreat and insist nothing important is missing. Late-night history does neither. It sits with the pause. It notices that when records thin out, imagination gets louder. The quieter the evidence, the more dramatic the stories become. That tells us more about ourselves than about the past. What makes these missing chapters unsettling is not that we do not know what happened. It is that people once did. Entire communities understood their world well enough to survive in it. They planned, they taught children, they argued about things that mattered to them. And all of that thinking dissolved, leaving behind walls, tools, and a few patterns someone much later decided were decorative. There is also something gently funny about how much authority we give to what survived by accident. A burned tablet becomes foundational. A preserved inscription becomes definitive. Meanwhile, thousands of equally important conversations disappeared because they were spoken instead of written on something that decayed politely. History rewards durability, not importance. That is not wisdom. That is physics. As science advances, it does not always clarify. Sometimes it sharpens the outline of what we cannot know. Better dating techniques tell us exactly when something existed, but not why it mattered. More discoveries increase the number of unanswered questions. Progress does not close the gaps. It makes them more visible. This is where late-night history finds its tone, calm, a little ironic, slightly amused by our need for certainty. The past does not owe us explanations. It does not exist to validate timelines or confirm narratives. It existed to be lived. The fact that it left us fragments instead of answers may be the most accurate thing it ever did. So when history goes quiet, do not rush to fill the silence. Let it be what it is, a reminder that knowledge is fragile, that memory is selective, that entire civilizations can slip out of the record not with a scream, but with a shrug. If this quiet keeps you company tonight, you are welcome to stay. Nothing here demands conclusions. Nothing here needs urgency. The past can rest, and so can you. The first fractures of writing, Tărtăria and Vinča, the first marks that refused to explain themselves. History usually begins with confidence, a line on a chart, a date chosen because it feels tidy. Writing begins here, civilization begins there. Everyone nods and moves on. Late-night history prefers moments when that confidence starts to wobble, when the lights are low enough for uncertainty to feel honest, when something small and fragile quietly refuses to stay in its assigned place. The hook is not a grand empire or a famous city. It is 3 small pieces of clay, palm-sized, uneven, easy to miss if you were not looking closely, found in the soil of modern Romania in the early 1960s. They arrived without ceremony and immediately caused discomfort, not because they were beautiful, not because they were elaborate, but because they were too early. At first glance, the tablets look unimpressive. Rough clay, simple shapes, marks pressed into the surface with no obvious artistry. They do not announce themselves as a breakthrough. They sit there quietly, as if slightly embarrassed to be noticed at all. And yet the moment they were dated, everything became awkward. The surrounding material suggested an age far older than what most textbooks were comfortable with, older than the first cities in Mesopotamia, older than what we like to call the beginning of writing. Late-night history enjoys this kind of awkwardness. It is the sound of a timeline clearing its throat. The marks themselves are the problem, or rather, the refusal of those marks to behave. They are repeated, ordered, deliberate. They do not look random, but they also do not explain themselves. There are lines, cross-like shapes, patterns that suggest sequence rather than decoration. Enough structure to make people argue, not enough clarity to make anyone relax. This is where the debate begins to stretch and yawn. Some scholars lean forward and whisper that these might be the earliest attempts to record information, not language as we know it, not sentences, but symbols used to track something important: goods, events, obligations. Memory externalized just enough to survive the day. Others lean back and insist that these are symbolic objects with meaning only within a specific cultural moment. Marks that mattered deeply to the people who made them and not at all to anyone else. Both sides sound reasonable, which is deeply annoying. What complicates the story further is that these tablets did not appear alone. Across the same region, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of artifacts from what we now call the Vinča culture. Pottery, figurines, tools, many of them marked with similar signs, simple shapes repeated across objects separated by distance and time. The kind of repetition that makes coincidence start to sweat. Again, the question returns. Are these symbols decorative? Are they ritual? Or are they something else entirely? A shared visual language that never quite crossed the line into full writing. A system that worked well enough that no one felt the need to formalize it further, until it vanished. Late night history pauses here and lets the silence do some work. It is tempting to imagine that writing arrived fully formed in one place and then spread outward like a brilliant idea everyone immediately agreed was useful. Reality is rarely that cooperative. Human beings experiment constantly. Most experiments fail quietly. Some succeed briefly and then disappear. The idea that people across different regions were playing with symbols long before any standardized script took over should not be shocking. It should be expected. What makes the Tărtăria tablets unsettling is not that they prove writing began somewhere else. They do not prove anything that neat. What they suggest instead is that the desire to mark meaning outside the mind may have been widespread and messy. People trying things, abandoning them, trying again, long before history decided where the official beginning would be. There is also a gentle irony in how fragile these beginnings are. 3 small tablets survived by accident. Thousands of other attempts may have dissolved back into mud without anyone noticing. We build entire narratives on what happened to endure, not on what mattered most. Durability is not the same as significance, but it often wins the argument. Science does its careful work here. It measures, it compares, it debates contamination and context. It admits that the tablets were baked after discovery which conveniently destroyed certain kinds of evidence while preserving the objects themselves. An act meant to save them that also limited what we can know. History has a sense of humor like that. Slightly cruel, very subtle. So where does that leave us? Somewhere uncomfortable, which is exactly where late-night history prefers to sit. These tablets do not overthrow the story of writing. They complicate it. They remind us that the past was not waiting patiently for a breakthrough moment. People were already thinking, already marking, already trying to leave traces of their world in material that might outlast a conversation. That some of those traces do not line up with our timelines is not a failure of the past. It is a limitation of our need for order. There is something quietly humbling in realizing that entire systems of meaning can vanish without leaving a translation guide. That a symbol can be deeply functional for centuries and then become unreadable forever. That we might be staring directly at evidence of early cognitive complexity and still have to shrug. Late-night history smiles gently at this, not mockingly, just knowingly. The first marks may never explain themselves, and that may be the most honest thing about them. They were not made for us. They were not meant to survive peer review. They existed to solve immediate problems in a world that felt urgent and ordinary to the people living in it. When the lights are low enough, this feels less like a mystery to be solved and more like a reminder. History is not a finished book. It is a collection of fragments that survived for reasons unrelated to importance. The Tărtăria tablets sit among those fragments, quietly doing what they have always done, existing, waiting, refusing to clarify, and that is enough. The village that drew before it wrote. After the first marks refuse to explain themselves, the story does not move forward. It drifts sideways. It lowers its voice. It wanders into kitchens, workshops, and quiet villages where no one was trying to invent anything permanent. This is where the Vinča world waits, not as a revelation, not as a solution, more like a habit that lasted long enough to leave traces and then stopped. Here's the hook. Imagine a community that keeps marking objects the way people today leave notes for themselves, not for display, not for legacy, just because it works. A line here, a shape there, repeated often enough that it feels normal, ordinary, useful in ways that never needed explaining. Then imagine that habit vanishing completely while the marks remain. That is not a mystery that announces itself. It is one that sits quietly and lets everyone else argue around it. The Vinča culture lived in southeastern Europe long before cities became obsessed with permanence. These were settled people, farmers, craftspeople, builders of houses that lasted long enough to matter. They worked clay constantly, pots, bowls, figurines, tools. And on many of these objects they left signs, simple shapes, lines, crosses, angles, not randomly placed, not carelessly repeated, but also not arranged in a way that clearly spells anything out. This is where discomfort enters the room. The signs appear across wide areas and long stretches of time. They show up on objects meant for daily use, not monuments. That detail matters. People do not usually decorate ordinary items with meaningless repetition unless it serves some quiet function. At the same time, the signs never develop into full writing. No long sequences, no clear evolution into grammar, no undeniable sentences. They hover in an in-between state that refuses to grow up.
Late-night history enjoys that refusal.
Some scholars suggest these marks were a system of ownership or production, a way to indicate who made something or where it belonged. Others suggest they were memory aids, visual prompts that meant something specific to the maker, but did not need to be understood by anyone else. There is also the possibility that they were symbolic without being linguistic, a shared visual shorthand that conveyed status roles or routines without ever becoming language. All of these explanations are plausible, which is another way of saying none of them fully satisfy. What is striking is how consistent the signs are. Across hundreds of artifacts, the same shapes reappear. They do not drift wildly. They do not collapse into chaos. This suggests intention sustained over generations, and yet there is no push toward expansion, no effort to record stories, events, or laws. It is as if the system did exactly what it needed to do and then politely declined further responsibility. There is something faintly humorous about that. Modern minds struggle with systems that do not escalate. We expect progress, development, a trajectory that leads somewhere impressive. When something remains stable and then disappears, we label it a failure or a dead end. But stability can be a sign of success. A tool that does not need improvement often gets abandoned only when circumstances change. The Vinča signs may represent a moment when marking objects was enough, when social memory still lived mostly in people rather than in records, when communities were small enough that everyone knew what the marks meant without explanation. Writing as we later define it may not have been necessary yet. This challenges the comforting idea that writing emerged because humans suddenly became smarter. Intelligence did not switch on. It adjusted to pressure. When societies grew larger, more complex, and less personal, memory needed help. Writing answered that need. Before then, lighter systems may have done the job quietly and well. Late-night history pauses here and lets that thought settle. There is also the question of disappearance. The Vinča culture faded, not with collapse or spectacle, but with gradual change. New materials, new movements of people, new ways of organizing life. When that happened, the signs lost their context. Without the community that understood them, they became mute. Symbols do not survive interpretation without users. This is where the unease deepens. We often imagine that meaning clings to objects, that it waits patiently to be decoded. In reality, meaning is relational. It lives between people. Once that network dissolves, the marks remain, but the understanding does not. The Vinča signs did not fail to speak. They were simply never meant to speak to us. There is a gentle irony in how much effort is spent trying to force them to. We line them up, we compare them, we search for patterns that resemble later scripts, we hope for a bridge. But sometimes there is no bridge. Sometimes there was a small local road that served its purpose and was abandoned when the landscape changed. Late-night history does not rush to rescue that road. Instead, it notices how familiar this behavior is. Humans constantly create systems that make sense only within a narrow context. Workplace codes, family habits, private jokes, entire symbolic worlds that vanish the moment the group disperses. The Vinča signs may simply be the archaeological version of that phenomenon scaled across centuries. There is something almost comforting in that thought. It reminds us that not everything was designed to last. Some things existed to support ordinary life and then step aside. Not every culture aimed to build an archive. Not every community felt the need to explain itself to the future. The silence we encounter now may not be loss, but indifference. The past moved on without leaving instructions. This does not make the Vinča signs trivial. It makes them honest. They show us a stage of human thought that is rarely acknowledged, one that sits between gesture and language, between memory and record, between the urge to mark and the need to explain, a stage that worked long enough to matter and then disappeared when it no longer fit. Late-night history smiles gently at that disappearance, not with nostalgia, not with regret, just recognition. The first marks refused to explain themselves. The next ones did not even try. They did their work quietly and let the future wonder why. That wondering tells us less about them and more about us. Our discomfort with systems that do not leave footnotes. Our hunger for beginnings that behave properly. The Vinča world does not offer a beginning. It offers a pause. A reminder that human history is not a straight climb toward complexity. It is a series of experiments, some of which leave traces and some of which do not. When the night gets quiet enough, this feels less like a puzzle and more like a mirror. We mark things every day that will mean nothing to anyone else tomorrow, and yet they matter now. For now, that is enough. The named gaps in history. The long pause after Rome, when memory learned to whisper. History likes to present Rome as a clean ending, a date circled in ink, a sentence that sounds final enough to close a chapter. Late-night history knows better. Endings are rarely neat. They stretch, they yawn, they leave the lights on in empty rooms. After Rome did not fall so much as it slowly stopped answering the phone. Messages went unanswered. Records thinned. The noise faded into a quiet that still makes people uneasy. If you are listening tonight, it is because that quiet never really ended. It only learned to speak more softly. When the Western Roman Empire dissolved, it did not take language with it. People still spoke, they argued, they traded, they remembered. What disappeared was the habit of writing everything down as if permanence were guaranteed. Rome loved records, taxes, laws, census lists, official correspondence. It believed the world could be managed if enough ink was applied. When that system broke, the writing did not vanish overnight. It simply lost its audience. Late-night history enjoys that moment when paperwork stops mattering. Across Europe, daily life continued. Fields were planted. Roads were reused. Old stones were repurposed into new walls. But the impulse to document each year in careful detail weakened. Not because people became less intelligent, but because survival demanded attention elsewhere. Writing takes time. Time is a luxury when stability collapses quietly rather than dramatically. What followed is often labeled a dark age, a phrase that says more about modern discomfort than historical reality. Dark does not mean empty. It means underlit. Fewer written sources survive, not because nothing happened, but because fewer people were paid to record it for posterity. Memory shifted from parchment to people, stories replaced ledgers. Names were remembered through repetition rather than inscription. Imagine an entire century represented by a handful of lines. A bad harvest noted, a battle mentioned briefly, a ruler named without explanation. The rest is silence. Not because nothing happened, but because no one thought it would matter to anyone else later. That assumption was reasonable at the time. Late-night history pauses here and lets the silence breathe. Modern readers find this unsettling. We are trained to trust what is written and doubt what is not. When records thin out, imagination rushes in to fill the space. Some imagine chaos, others imagine stagnation. Both are projections. The truth is quieter and far less dramatic. Life shrank in scale, authority localized, communities became more self-contained. There was less need for grand narratives and more need for practical memory. Written history favors centralized power. When power fragments writing often follows, not out of ignorance but out of relevance. Why record imperial decrees when there is no empire to enforce them? Why maintain archives when no one is paid to guard them? Paperwork does not survive neglect well. There is also a subtle irony here. The centuries we know least about may be the ones closest to everyday human experience. Without official texts, we are left with traces, broken pottery, reused buildings, burial practices. These fragments speak softly but honestly. They do not exaggerate victories or polish reputations. They show people adapting. Late-night history prefers that tone. The idea that Europe forgot how to write after Rome is misleading. Writing continued in pockets, but it became selective, used when necessary rather than automatically. Literacy narrowed, not because it was despised, but because it was no longer essential for most tasks. Oral tradition carried law, custom, and identity more efficiently than parchment in unstable conditions. This makes modern historians uncomfortable. We want continuity. We want documents that confirm one another. Instead, we get gaps. Long pauses where centuries blur together. We label them dark because we cannot see clearly, not because they were empty. There is a faint humor in how offended modern systems feel by this, as if the past has broken a contract by failing to document itself properly, as if those centuries owed us clarity. Late-night history smiles at that expectation. The past did not know we were coming. Archaeology helps, but it does not replace narrative. It tells us what existed, not how it felt. A village foundation shows continuity, but not anxiety. A repaired wall shows effort, but not intention. Without writing, we infer, carefully, often wrongly. And yet something important emerges from this scarcity. The collapse of Roman administration did not erase knowledge. It redistributed it. Skills moved from institutions to individuals. Craft knowledge became localized. Authority became personal rather than bureaucratic. Memory lived in people rather than files. There is a calm realism in that shift. These centuries were not waiting rooms for something better. They were lived in fully by the people who experienced them. They did not know they were between eras. They knew only that the old systems no longer worked, and new ones were forming slowly, without instruction manuals. Late-night history notices how often this pattern repeats. Large systems collapse, record-keeping falters. Life continues anyway. The silence in the archives is not absence, it is compression. Too much happening at once for neat summaries. This is why the period after Rome resists clean storytelling. There is no single voice, no central authority narrating events. History fragments into local stories that never reunite. When later writers attempt to reconstruct these centuries, they rely on guesswork inference and the occasional surviving note scribbled by someone who did not expect to be quoted. There is something gently unsettling about that. It suggests that the historical record is not a neutral mirror, but a byproduct of administration. When administration fades, so does the illusion of continuity. Late-night history does not mourn this. It accepts it. Because in that pause after Rome, we see something honest. Civilization is not a straight line. It breathes, it contracts and expands. Writing is not guaranteed. Memory is not permanent. What survives is shaped by power, resources, and chance. The centuries after Rome did not forget the world. They simply stopped narrating it for an audience that no longer existed. When writing returned in force, it did so with new priorities, new myths, and new structures of authority. What we call the gap is really a transition we struggle to see because it did not leave subtitles. Late-night history lowers its voice here. Not to dramatize, but to respect the quiet. Those centuries were not dark, they were private. And perhaps that is why they still make us uneasy. They remind us that history can go on without explaining itself. And sometimes it does. Searching for people in the silence, Atlantis Oz, and the habit of missing faces. After memory learned to whisper, it did not stop speaking. It simply changed the way it left evidence. The pause after Rome was not an ending, but a change in volume. And when volume drops, the ear begins to strain. Late-night history notices this instinct. When records thin out, we do not only search for events, we search for people. We search for the sense that someone was there, that lives were lived with intention even if no one bothered to write a summary. Here's the hook. Imagine walking into a room. After a conversation has ended, the chairs are warm, the air still holds a trace of breath, but the speakers are gone. You know people were there. You just cannot prove who they were or what they agreed on. That is how large portions of history feel once writing steps aside. Not empty, just recently abandoned. In that quiet, our minds develop a habit. We begin inventing names for the missing. We draw outlines around absence. We create places like Atlantis and Oz, not because we crave fantasy, but because we dislike facelessness. A civilization without a name feels unfinished. A culture without a story feels disrespectful. So we label the silence and hope it answers back. Late-night history does not mock this impulse. It understands it. Humans are social creatures, even when studying the dead. We want to know who held power, who argued, who lost. When records disappear, the past becomes impersonal. And impersonality makes us uneasy. The idea of Atlantis sits comfortably in this unease. It is a placeholder more than a destination, a way to say something significant existed and then slipped beneath the surface. The details change constantly. Islands move, timelines stretch, technologies appear suspiciously modern. None of that is the point. The point is the instinct. Atlantis represents the belief that complexity can vanish without leaving a user manual. Oz works differently but serves the same emotional function. It is not submerged. It is hidden behind curtains and smoke, a place that feels organized, yet strangely undocumented. Everyone agrees it exists within the story, but no one can quite explain how it runs. Authority appears symbolic. Power feels theatrical. The machinery is real, but the narrative is incomplete. Late-night history smiles gently at this comparison. What both places share is not geography but tone. They are imagined answers to a specific discomfort. The discomfort of knowing that real societies may have existed beyond our ability to describe them accurately. Not myths, not fairy tales. Ordinary communities that built systems, worked land, and raised children without ever appearing in a chronicle. The centuries after Rome are full of these almost people. They appear briefly in archaeology and then vanish again. A settlement footprint, a reused road, a cluster of graves. Enough evidence to confirm presence, but not enough to restore personality. We know someone organized labor, someone made decisions, someone enforced rules, but the someone remains anonymous. This anonymity unsettles modern minds trained on biographies and leaders. We want faces. We want heroes or villains. When history denies us those, we begin to suspect something is missing, and something is missing. Names, voices, motives. But that absence does not imply fantasy. It implies loss. There is a quiet irony here. We often accuse the past of being obsessed with monuments and legacy. In reality, many societies functioned without caring whether strangers centuries later would understand them. They did not brand themselves. They did not archive for external audiences. They lived locally and moved on. Late-night history respects that indifference. The danger appears when silence becomes a blank canvas rather than a boundary. When we treat missing records as invitations rather than limits. Atlantis becomes a technological superpower. Oz becomes a fully formed system with clear metaphors. The silence is no longer allowed to remain silent. It is dressed up and asked to perform. But silence has its own meaning. The absence of detailed records often signals decentralization, small-scale governance, oral transmission, flexible identities, systems that adapt rather than preserve. These do not photograph well. They leave fewer ruins. They resist storytelling. That resistance does not make them imaginary. It makes them hard to package. Think of how many lives today would leave little trace if documentation stopped tomorrow. How many neighborhoods operate smoothly without formal records? How many decisions are made through habit rather than policy? The past likely functioned the same way more often than we admit. Atlantis and Oz become attractive when we forget this. They offer centralized explanations, singular locations, a sense that everything important happens somewhere identifiable. This is comforting. It suggests that loss is manageable. Find the place, and you find the answers. Late-night history leans back and lets that comfort dissolve. The truth is more diffuse. People existed everywhere. Systems overlapped. Influence moved slowly and unevenly. When writing thinned, these processes continued without leaving tidy outlines. The result is not a missing civilization, but a missing narrative style. We struggle to accept that because it denies us closure. There is also humor in how confidently we project modern anxieties backward. We imagine lost worlds, obsessed with power, technology, or spectacle, because those are the things we fear losing now. The past becomes a mirror for contemporary unease. Atlantis sinks under the weight of modern expectation. Oz hides behind illusion because we are suspicious of appearances. Late-night history notices this pattern and quietly steps aside. Instead of asking where Atlantis was, it asks why we need it. Instead of searching for Oz, it listens to the quiet between known facts. That quiet suggests something less dramatic and more unsettling. That history does not require coherence to function. That large stretches of human experience passed without leaving a transcript. The people we are searching for in the silence may not have wanted to be found, or they may have assumed that being remembered was not the point. Survival was. Continuity was. The rest was optional. This does not mean we should stop looking. Archaeology matters, careful inference matters, but imagination should know when to lower its voice. The silence after Rome, and in countless other periods, is not asking to be filled. It is asking to be acknowledged. Late-night history finds peace there. Atlantis and Oz are useful as metaphors. They remind us that absence bothers us deeply, that we crave stories even when evidence resists. But they should remain symbols of uncertainty, not replacements for it. The real lesson of missing faces is humility. Our knowledge is partial, our reconstructions provisional. The past was not designed to satisfy modern curiosity. It existed on its own terms and then moved out quietly, without leaving forwarding addresses. When memory learned to whisper, it did not become weak. It became selective. What it chose to keep was not narrative but residue, traces of action without commentary, evidence without explanation. Late-night history sits with that residue. It does not demand names. It does not force meaning. It acknowledges that some people were there even if we cannot say who they were. And perhaps that is enough. Because in that silence we recognize something familiar, the knowledge that most lives do not leave monuments, and yet they matter anyway. Personal and collective chronicles that slipped away, the book that refused to be read, a letter with no key. The hook arrives quietly, not with a discovery in a desert or a city pulled from the sea, but with a book sitting on a table doing absolutely nothing. No glowing artifacts, no dramatic inscriptions, just pages, hundreds of them, filled edge to edge with symbols that look deliberate, confident, and entirely uninterested in helping you understand them. This is not a book that asks for attention. It assumes it already has it, and that assumption alone is unsettling. Late-night history has a soft spot for objects like this, things that survived without explanation, things that look meaningful but never say why. The Voynich manuscript does not shout mystery, it whispers inconvenience. It is heavy enough to feel real, old enough to matter, structured enough to suggest intention, and useless enough to mock every attempt at certainty. The manuscript appears in the historical record in the early 20th century, but its physical age is much older. The pages are filled with flowing characters that repeat in patterns. Not random, not decorative. They follow rules. Some symbols appear only at the beginnings of lines. Others cluster together as if grammar exists somewhere behind the curtain. The text looks like language the way a silhouette looks like a person, familiar in shape, empty in detail. People have been trying to read it for more than a century. Cryptographers, linguists, mathematicians, hobbyists, and the occasional very confident amateur have all taken turns believing they were about to solve it. None have stayed solved for long. Every breakthrough announcement eventually returns quietly to the shelf. Late-night history finds that pattern reassuring. The drawings add another layer of discomfort. Plants that resemble nothing found in nature yet feel botanically serious. Diagrams that look technical without clarifying their purpose. Figures that appear engaged in activities that never quite resolve into explanation. It is as if the book is performing knowledge rather than conveying it, as if it remembers how learning feels but forgot what it was about. The most tempting response is suspicion. Surely this is a hoax, a joke taken too far, a prank that escaped its century. That theory has been raised many times and dismissed almost as often. Creating a fake book with this level of internal consistency would require a dedication bordering on obsession. Sustaining that effort without any payoff for decades feels less like humor and more like work. And work leaves traces. The ink composition, the parchment dating, the structure of the text itself, all suggest a genuine artifact from a real moment in history. That moment simply refuses to explain itself. The book behaves like something that once made sense to someone and no longer does. This is where late-night history leans in. We tend to imagine the past as legible if we try hard enough. Given enough time and technology, everything will yield. The Voynich manuscript resists that belief gently but firmly. It suggests that meaning is not permanent, that systems of knowledge can exist fully and then dissolve without leaving a translation. There is something faintly comic in how personally we take this, as if the book is being rude, as if it owes us comprehension. We throw algorithms at it. We compare letter frequencies. We search for hidden patterns. And the text continues, calmly being itself. Some have suggested the manuscript represents a lost constructed language. Others argue it is a form of shorthand, a private code, a mnemonic system never meant to be read by outsiders. All of these ideas share a common assumption, that the book was created to be understood, that it failed at its purpose. Late-night history questions that assumption. What if the book did exactly what it was meant to do? What if it functioned perfectly within a small context and then outlived that context by accident? The problem may not be that we cannot read it. The problem may be that we were never meant to. Consider how many systems today would become unreadable in a few centuries. Technical manuals, personal notes, internal documentation written for specific teams using shared assumptions. Strip away the living context, and the text collapses into symbols. The Voynich manuscript may be nothing more exotic than that. A book written for someone who knew the rules, someone who did not imagine strangers peering at it under laboratory lights. This does not make it less fascinating. It makes it more honest. The manuscript sits at an uncomfortable intersection. It looks like a record but behaves like memory, structured but fragile, detailed but inaccessible. It reminds us that preservation does not guarantee understanding. Survival is not the same as transmission. Late-night history lingers on that distinction. There is also the matter of obsession. The manuscript attracts it. People project their hopes onto it. Some see proof of advanced lost knowledge. Others see confirmation that history hides secrets deliberately. These reactions say less about the book and more about us. We are uncomfortable with the idea that something meaningful can exist beyond our interpretive reach. Silence feels like a challenge. The manuscript does not confirm or deny any theory. It absorbs them. It remains unchanged. Its greatest trick is patience. It does not age into clarity. It waits. There is a soft irony in how modern tools have failed here. Computers excel at patterns. They identify structure instantly. They confirm that the text is not random, and then they stop. Structure without semantics is a wall rather than a door. This is deeply unsettling for a culture that equates pattern recognition with progress. Late-night history suggests a different reading. The manuscript is not a puzzle box. It is a reminder that knowledge is relational, that meaning lives in communities, not objects. When communities vanish, meaning often goes with them. The book may once have been practical, useful, boring even, a reference, a guide, something consulted and then put away. The fact that it now appears mystical may be an accident of survival. It outlived its instructions. There is humor in that. Imagine a grocery list becoming an artifact of wonder because the language it was written in disappeared. Scholars arguing over the symbolism of bread and milk. Entire theories built on shopping habits. Late-night history smiles at the thought. The Voynich manuscript forces a kind of humility that few artifacts manage. It resists categorization. It refuses to be either fraud or revelation. It sits comfortably in the middle ground where certainty does not apply. And that middle ground is where history spends most of its time. We prefer clear narratives, beginnings, endings, decipherments. The manuscript offers none of these. It offers endurance without explanation, presence without access, a past that does not care whether it is understood. Late-night history does not try to fix this. It accepts it because the book is not broken. Our expectations are. We assume that everything preserved must be interpretable, that archives exist to be decoded. The Voynich manuscript suggests a quieter truth. Some things survive simply because they were not destroyed, not because they were meant to speak across centuries. In the end, the manuscript may never be read, and that may be the most accurate outcome. It would preserve the integrity of its silence. It would remind us that history includes not only stories we can tell, but also those we cannot. Late-night history finds comfort there. In the dim hours when certainty softens, the book feels less like a challenge and more like company. It sits, it waits, it refuses to explain itself. And in doing so, it tells us something honest about the past. Not everything was meant for us. Some letters arrive without keys, and they are still worth keeping. When letters survive, but meaning does not. The alphabet that forgot its voice. The hook arrives softly, almost apologetically. Imagine discovering a box of letters where every character is perfectly preserved. Ink still confident on the page, shapes unmistakably intentional. You recognize the alphabet. You know how each symbol sounds. You could read it aloud without hesitation, and yet nothing appears. No meaning, no sense. The letters perform their duty flawlessly, while the message itself refuses to show up. This is not ignorance. This is something stranger. This is comprehension without understanding. Late-night history listens carefully here, because this is where certainty finally gives up and pretends it meant to all along. After the book that refused to be read, the discomfort does not fade. It changes form. The problem is no longer an unknown script. It is something more unsettling, familiar symbols that no longer say anything. Writing without context is not communication. It is choreography, beautiful, precise, and empty. We like to believe that once letters are deciphered, the hard part is over, that cracking the code unlocks the world behind it. Late-night history smiles gently at this optimism. Letters are tools. They point, they reference, they assume shared ground. Remove that ground and the letters continue working perfectly while the meaning slips quietly out the back door. This is where many historical frustrations live. We have alphabets, we have sounds, we even have grammar. What we do not have is the agreement that once made those systems useful. Words are social contracts. When the society dissolves, the contract expires. There is something faintly ironic about how proud we are of deciphering scripts. We celebrate the moment symbols become readable again. But reading is not the same as understanding. Pronunciation is not comprehension. A sentence spoken into the void remains a sound. Late-night history lingers on this distinction. Consider how much modern communication would become meaningless without context. Emails without office culture. Text messages without shared jokes. Manuals without the machines they describe. The symbols remain accurate. The meaning does not. The past is full of these half-resurrections. We can read the letters, we can translate the words, but we cannot reconstruct the assumptions that made those words matter. What was obvious then is invisible now. What was implied has vanished completely. This is why some texts feel flat even when translated perfectly. The tone is gone, the urgency is gone, the audience is gone. We are listening in on a conversation that ended long before we arrived. Late-night history finds this quietly unsettling rather than tragic. We often treat missing context as a puzzle to be solved. If we just dig deeper, find one more inscription, cross-reference, one more artifact, then the meaning will snap back into place. Sometimes it does. Often it does not. Context is not a thing you can always recover. It is an atmosphere. Once dispersed, it does not gather again. There is also a subtle comedy in how confidently we project our own meanings onto ancient words. When we lack context, we substitute ourselves. We read our concerns into their phrases, our priorities into their records. The letters allow this because they are obedient. They do not resist interpretation. They simply sit there while we argue. Late-night history notices how often certainty grows loudest where evidence is thinnest. A single word can survive while the world that shaped it disappears. Without knowing how it was used, who used it, or why it mattered, the word becomes a shell. It can be filled with almost anything. That flexibility is dangerous and convenient. This is how writing can lie without changing a single letter. Even when translation is accurate, meaning can remain inaccessible, a legal term without the legal system that enforced it, a title without the hierarchy that gave it weight, a description of an event without understanding why it was worth recording. We read and nod and miss the point entirely. Late-night history lowers its voice here. The silence that follows a text is often more informative than the text itself. What is not explained tells us what did not need explanation at the time. What is not defined reveals shared understanding now lost. Context was so complete it never had to be written down. This is why some of the most frustrating historical documents are the most mundane. Lists, inventories, brief notes. They assume knowledge we do not have. They reference people, places, or practices as if everyone already knows. And everyone did. Once. There is a temptation to treat this loss as failure, as if the past was careless, as if it should have documented itself better. Late-night history rejects this accusation gently. The past did not exist to instruct us. It existed to function. Context is expensive to preserve. It requires continuity, institutions, education, stability. When those fade, writing becomes skeletal, letters without flesh. The book that refused to be read taught us that symbols can survive without keys. Now we learn that even when the key exists, the door may lead nowhere, because the room itself has collapsed. This is not a flaw in writing. It is a reminder of its limits. Writing freezes language. Context does not freeze well. It evaporates. Tone, humor, urgency, irony, shared fear, shared hope, all of it leaks out over time. What remains is the outline. Late-night history finds something almost tender in this. The letters did their job. They endured. They crossed centuries. They waited patiently. It is not their fault the world they pointed to no longer exists. There is also humility here. We like to believe our own writing will explain us perfectly to the future, that our records are clear enough, that our intentions are obvious. The past suggests otherwise. Even with alphabets, intact understanding is fragile. Imagine someone reading our documents without knowing our assumptions, our metaphors, our systems, our invisible rules. They would read fluently and understand nothing important. Late-night history smiles at the thought. This does not mean historical study is futile. It means it requires restraint, the ability to accept partial understanding, the willingness to leave some words untranslated in spirit, even if they are translated in form. Meaning does not always return. Sometimes it stays gone. There is something unsettling about that realization. We are not guaranteed access to the inner lives of those who came before. We may know what they wrote without knowing what they meant. And that gap may never close. Late-night history does not rush to fill it. Instead, it treats the silence as part of the record. Letters without meaning are not empty. They testify to loss, to change, to the fact that human communication depends on fragile agreements. The alphabet remembered its shape. It forgot its voice. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy writing can leave. Not a message, not a lesson, but proof that someone once spoke here. Places where only physical traces remain. The cities that left no names. When size outpaced memory. The hook begins with a strange contradiction. Imagine standing on a plane wide enough to lose the horizon where foundations stretch farther than your eyes can comfortably track. Streets implied by absence. Homes suggested by scars in the soil. A place built for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people, and yet no plaque greets you, no name survives, no inscription explains who decided this place should exist. The city is immense. The silence is complete. Late-night history pauses here because scale without narration feels like a rule violation. We were promised that big things leave big stories. This one did not get the memo. History is comfortable with cities that introduce themselves properly. Rome carved its name into stone. Athens left commentary everywhere. Later capitals stamped identity onto everything that stood still long enough. These cities understood publicity. They wanted to be remembered. They invested in that ambition. But long before cities learned to perform importance, there were settlements that simply functioned. They grew because people stayed. They expanded because survival worked better together. No one stopped to announce that a city had happened. Late-night history prefers these places. Across prehistoric and early historic landscapes, archaeologists keep encountering sites that should not exist according to traditional expectations. Vast arrangements of homes laid out with intention, infrastructure that required planning, coordination, and time, evidence of organized labor without evidence of officialdom. These were not temporary camps. They were not villages pretending to be more. They were cities in practice, if not in self-description. The discomfort begins when we try to place them on a timeline. We want origins, founders, moments of declaration. Instead, we find gradual accumulation. One house added near another, paths worn into roots, storage areas growing larger. The city does not arrive. It emerges. An emergence is difficult to credit. There is something faintly comic about how suspicious we become of organization without paperwork. When no written record exists, we instinctively downplay complexity. Surely it could not have been that coordinated. Surely the scale is exaggerated. But the ground disagrees. Foundations do not lie out of politeness. They mark where weight once pressed day after day. These settlements often predate writing or exist alongside cultures that did not prioritize documentation. Their builders were busy. They were feeding people, managing resources, solving problems that demanded attention rather than commentary. Writing things down would not have helped the roof stay up. Late-night history lets that practicality speak quietly. The absence of names unsettles us most. A city without a name feels incomplete, as if identity itself has gone missing. But naming is not universal, it is cultural. Some societies name places, others simply live in them. The need to label is often a response to distance. When you expect outsiders to arrive, you name things. When everyone knows where they are, names feel unnecessary. Imagine referring to your home as the place where we live. For generations, that was enough. The scale of these unnamed cities challenges another assumption. That complexity requires hierarchy, that large populations demand visible authority. Archaeology suggests something less theatrical, neighborhoods repeated rather than centralized, homes similar in size rather than stacked in status, shared spaces without monumental dominance, coordination without spectacle. Late-night history notices how uncomfortable this makes modern narratives. We prefer pyramids to floor plans, thrones to kitchens, but kitchens feed cities, floors remember footsteps. These places were built by people who understood repetition better than proclamation. They did not need a skyline to validate their existence. There is also the matter of disappearance. Many of these cities were abandoned deliberately, not destroyed, not conquered, simply left behind. Sometimes they were burned in controlled ways, perhaps as part of closure rituals or safety practices. Sometimes they were left intact and slowly reclaimed by soil. People moved on. The city did not chase them. This behavior confuses modern expectations. We imagine cities clinging to relevance, expanding, competing. But these settlements appear content to end when conditions changed. Resources shifted. Climate altered. Trade routes evolved. Staying no longer made sense. So they left. Late night history finds something quietly admirable in that restraint. The lack of written records does not mean lack of memory. Oral traditions may have carried these cities forward for generations. Stories told around fires, directions passed through habit, knowledge encoded in practice rather than text. When those chains broke, memory faded. The ground remained. Archaeology reads this ground patiently. It measures distances, counts dwellings, estimates population, and then stops. Because numbers do not tell stories, they only confirm presence. The emotional texture is gone. This is where imagination becomes dangerous and necessary. We try to picture daily life. We wonder who argued, who organized work, who decided where the next house should go. Without records, every reconstruction risks projection. We fill the silence with ourselves. Late night history resists that temptation gently. It accepts that some cities existed without leaving personalities behind. That anonymity does not equal insignificance. It may even signal success, a place so integrated into daily life that it never needed a narrator. There is irony here. Modern cities generate endless documentation, zoning laws, meeting minutes, data trails. And yet they often feel less coherent than these ancient unnamed places. Bureaucracy multiplies as trust declines. Writing expands as memory fragments. The unnamed cities operated on shared understanding. People knew their roles because repetition taught them. Knowledge moved horizontally rather than vertically. When change came, the system adapted until it no longer could. Late night history notices how rare this feels now. We are taught to equate progress with record keeping, to believe that without documentation, systems collapse. The archaeological record suggests otherwise. For long stretches of time, humans organized large populations, using methods that left no written trace. That reality unsettles institutions built on archives. There is also humor in imagining these cities viewed through modern lenses. Where is the city hall? Who was the mayor? Where are the tax records? The ground answers none of these questions and does not apologize. Instead, it offers something more honest. Evidence of collaboration without exhibition, of scale achieved through accumulation rather than command, of urban life that did not consider itself historic. Late night history leans into that humility. These cities remind us that importance is often assigned after the fact. While living there, no one thought they were part of a lost civilization. They were part of a functioning one. The label comes later when absence invites curiosity. We may never know what these places called themselves. We may never recover their internal logic fully. But we know they existed. We know they housed thousands. We know they solved problems long enough to matter. And perhaps that is sufficient. History does not require names to validate experience. Memory does not need inscriptions to prove life happened. The ground remembers weight, walls remember effort, layout remembers intention. Late night history finds comfort in that kind of evidence. The unnamed cities did not vanish because they failed. They vanished because time moved and humans followed it. The fact that they left no autobiography does not diminish them. It protects them from misinterpretation. They remain what they were, places people lived, and in a world obsessed with being remembered, that quiet fact feels unexpectedly radical. The city that walked away from itself, Cucuteni Tripilia, and the art of leaving. After the cities that left no names, there is another kind of disappearance, one that feels more deliberate, more unsettling. Not a city erased by invasion or disaster, but a city that seems to have packed its habits, folded its routines, and stepped quietly out of the frame. Late-night history leans closer here, because this is not loss by accident. This is absence with fingerprints. Here's the hook. Imagine a settlement so large it bends the definition of prehistoric. Tens of thousands of people living in coordinated neighborhoods. Houses arranged with repetition. Streets implied by movement. Storage systems that assume planning. And then imagine this entire place being burned, not in panic, but with care. One house at a time, again and again. Generation after generation. Until finally there is nothing left to burn because no one is left to stay. The city does not collapse. It concludes. The Cucuteni Tripilia world spread across parts of what is now Eastern Europe long before writing became a habit. These were not small villages pretending to be important. These were large, organized settlements that required cooperation on a scale that makes modern assumptions uncomfortable. They built thousands of homes, often in circular patterns. They repeated layouts with discipline. This was not improvisation. This was intention practiced patiently. Late-night history notices how calm this feels. The houses themselves tell the story. Built of wood and clay, they were not designed to last forever. And yet they were rebuilt over and over again on the same sites. Each cycle ended the same way. Fire controlled burning. Walls collapsed inward. The remains sealed beneath new layers. The city grew upward, as much as outward, like memory stacked on itself. At first, this burning puzzled researchers. Fire usually signals disaster, but here the pattern repeats too evenly, too consistently, too deliberately. These were not raids, not accidents. The fire appears to have been part of the system, a planned ending before a planned beginning. Late-night history allows the silence to linger before interpreting. One possibility is renewal, burning as closure, a way to reset space. Another is hygiene. Fire cleans. It removes pests, decay, and residue. In a dense settlement, this would matter. There is also the possibility of ritual, but that word is slippery and easily abused. Better to say that burning had meaning shared by the community, even if we no longer understand it. What matters more is what followed. After centuries of growth, these settlements were eventually abandoned. Not violently, not suddenly. People dispersed, the cities emptied, and the pattern stopped. There are no written explanations, no farewell inscriptions, no dramatic endings. The ground is left to speak for itself. This is where late-night history becomes quietest. Archaeology shows us scale, but not motive. We can count houses, we can estimate population, we can analyze soil and debris, but we cannot hear the conversations that led to leaving. We do not know whether people argued about staying. We do not know if departure felt like relief or loss. We only know that it happened thoroughly. This challenges modern instincts. Large systems are expected to resist change, to cling to infrastructure, to fight decline. These cities did not. They left when conditions shifted. Climate changes, resource pressures, new social patterns. The reasons are debated. The response is clear. They walked away. There is something unsettling about that level of coordination. Leaving a city of that size requires agreement, or at least shared momentum. It suggests social structures capable of collective decision-making without centralized command. People moved because movement made sense, not because someone ordered it. Late-night history finds this both admirable and faintly uncomfortable. We prefer stories of collapse because they feel dramatic and familiar. Collapse assigns blame. It provides spectacle. Abandonment is quieter. It implies agency. It suggests that people recognized limits and responded without ceremony. The Cucuteni Tripilia cities did not die. They were finished. There is also the matter of memory. Once abandoned, these places did not remain sacred ruins. They were not maintained as symbols. New generations moved into different patterns. The old cities faded into the landscape. Memory did not cling. The ground absorbed them. This absence of nostalgia is striking. Modern societies struggle to let go of cities, even when they no longer serve their purpose. Infrastructure becomes identity. Leaving feels like failure. The Cucuteni Tripilia pattern suggests a different relationship with place. Cities were tools, not monuments. When the tool no longer worked, it was set aside. Late-night history notices how radical that feels now. Without writing, there was no obligation to preserve a narrative. No need to explain the decision to future readers. The act did not require justification beyond its effectiveness. People did what they needed to do and moved on. The traces left behind are modest: broken pottery, foundations, ash layers, footprints pressed into floors. These fragments speak of daily life, not grand events: cooking, storage, repetition. The rhythms of a place designed to function rather than impress. When archaeologists uncover these sites, the scale surprises them every time. We expect early societies to be small, to grow slowly, to stumble into complexity. The Cucuteni Tripilia settlements contradict that expectation. They show that large populations can organize without writing, without monuments, without visible hierarchy. Late-night history smiles quietly at this contradiction. It suggests that our definitions of civilization are too narrow, that we mistake documentation for sophistication, that we equate memory with writing and forget that memory can be embodied in practice. These cities remembered themselves through repetition, through building the same houses in the same patterns, through shared routines passed on by doing rather than describing. When those routines no longer fit the environment, memory adapted by moving. There is also irony in how complete the disappearance feels. For centuries, these cities dominated their regions. Then they vanished so thoroughly that later populations did not even reuse the space in the same way. The landscape reset. History moved on without annotation. Late-night history sits with that erasure without trying to dramatize it. The temptation is to romanticize, to imagine secret knowledge, advanced systems lost to time. That temptation misses the point. The power of these cities lies not in mystery but in practicality. They worked until they did not. Then they stopped. That may be the most unsettling lesson of all. The Cucuteni Tripilia world shows us that human societies are capable of large-scale coordination without obsession over permanence, that cities do not have to endure to be successful, that leaving can be as intelligent as building. In a culture obsessed with legacy, this feels almost subversive. Late-night history does not celebrate or condemn this pattern. It observes it. It notices that the absence of names and texts does not equal absence of thought. Decisions were made, values were held, they were simply not written down. We may never know what these people called themselves. We may never recover their internal logic fully, but we can see the outcome. A civilization that grew large, lived deliberately, and then dispersed without spectacle. That quiet ending lingers. After the cities that left no names, this is the city that left itself. Not through collapse, but through choice. Not with fire from outside, but with fire applied carefully from within. Late night history finds something deeply human in that restraint. It reminds us that survival is not always about holding on. Sometimes it is about knowing when to let go. And in the long silence that followed, the land kept the record. Ash layers, footprints, broken cups. Enough to say someone was here. Enough to show they knew how to leave. Nothing more was required. The quiet game between memory and evidence. When the record breaks, how absence teaches us to invent. The hook begins with a small and slightly embarrassing truth. When the lights are low and the archive shelves start to look thinner than we expected, we do not become patient. We become creative. Faced with missing pages, we do not wait quietly for evidence to return. We start talking. We start guessing. We start telling stories that feel better than silence. Late night history notices this habit because it says less about the past and more about our discomfort with not knowing. We are not afraid of being wrong. We are afraid of there being nothing to say. When records disappear, the human mind does not slow down. It accelerates. Gaps invite motion. A broken timeline becomes a stage. Suddenly, every fragment looks symbolic. Every ruin looks intentional. Every coincidence begins to glow with meaning. The less we know, the more confident we become about what must have happened. This is not arrogance. It is anxiety disguised as imagination. Late night history sits with this tension rather than resolving it. In periods where documentation thins out, stories multiply. Not because people were more mysterious, but because we have less to contradict ourselves with. When few sources survive, each one becomes elastic. A single line can be stretched into an epic. A vague reference can support entire theories. The silence around it allows imagination to echo without resistance. There is a gentle irony here. The more complete a historical record is, the less room there is for fantasy. Detailed archives are boring that way. They correct us. They interrupt speculation. They insist on nuance. Scarcity does the opposite. It encourages certainty built on very little. Late night history finds this slightly amusing. Take any poorly documented century and watch what happens. Legends bloom. Lost technologies appear. Entire civilizations rise and fall between sentences. We assume complexity because we want continuity. We assume hidden mastery because we want to believe nothing important ever truly disappears. The idea that something ordinary simply ended without explanation feels unsatisfying. So we decorate the gap. This decoration often says more about the period doing the imagining than the period being imagined. When modern societies worry about collapse, they imagine lost golden ages. When technology advances rapidly, people imagine ancient equivalents that somehow vanished. Each era projects its anxieties backward into the dark. Late night history notices the pattern repeat quietly. The absence of writing creates a vacuum, but not an empty one. It fills with stories shaped by fear, hope, and desire. We do not invent randomly, we invent strategically. We create narratives that soothe us. If something was lost, it must have been extraordinary. If knowledge vanished, it must have been powerful. If people disappeared, they must have known something we forgot. This logic flatters us while pretending to humble us. There is also a subtle comfort in imagining hidden sophistication. It suggests that progress is cyclical rather than fragile, that nothing is ever truly lost, only misplaced. The truth is more unsettling. Knowledge requires maintenance, memory requires effort. When systems fail, things do vanish. Quietly, permanently. Late-night history does not rush to soften that reality. Incomplete manuscripts are a perfect example. When text breaks off, we do not accept the ending. We speculate, we imagine what must have followed. Sometimes we build entire philosophies on fragments. The fragment becomes more influential than a complete work because it invites participation. Everyone gets to finish the thought. There is humor in this if you step back far enough. A missing page becomes a mirror. People see what they want to see. The less information available, the more personal the interpretation becomes. Objectivity suffers. Confidence grows. Late-night history smiles gently at this contradiction. Archaeological gaps behave the same way. A structure without explanation becomes ceremonial. A tool without clear function becomes symbolic. Practical solutions are often ignored in favor of more dramatic interpretations. The mundane does not satisfy the imagination the way mystery does. But most of the past was mundane. People cooked, cleaned, argued, repaired things, and worried about weather. They did not leave dramatic records of these activities because they did not consider them notable. When those records disappear later, generations struggle to accept that everyday life could be the explanation. So we replace it with something grander. This tendency is not malicious, it is human. Silence makes us nervous. We equate not knowing with loss of control. Filling the gap restores a sense of mastery. We feel productive when we invent. Late-night history lowers its voice here. There is a difference between interpretation and invention. Interpretation stays close to evidence. Invention uses evidence as decoration. When records are incomplete, the line blurs easily, especially when patience runs out. Modern tools make this worse. Data visualization, pattern recognition, and modeling can give thin evidence an undeserved sense of weight. A few points connected by lines look convincing even if the lines are imaginary. Technology gives speculation confidence. Late-night history does not reject imagination. It asks it to sit down. Because imagination without restraint becomes replacement. It stops asking questions and starts delivering answers. That is when myth takes over not as story but as explanation. There is also a moral temptation at work. We like to believe that people before us were either wiser or more foolish. Both positions allow us to define ourselves clearly. Missing records let us choose whichever version suits us best. The past becomes a screen. In some cases, entire identities are constructed around absence. Groups claim lineage from unknown peoples. Cultures borrow fragments and stitch them into new narratives. None of this is inherently wrong. Stories help people locate themselves. But problems arise when stories harden into facts simply because no one can disprove them. Late-night history remains cautious here. It remembers that uncertainty is not an enemy. It is a condition. Gaps are not invitations to certainty. They are reminders of limits. The most honest response to missing records is restraint. To say we do not know and sit with that discomfort. This is difficult. It feels unproductive. It does not reward imagination. It does not offer closure, and yet it respects the past more than invention does. When we accept that some things are gone, we also accept that history is not a complete system. It is a partial archive shaped by survival and chance. What remains is not a curated selection. It is debris. Late-night history treats debris carefully. There is also humility in recognizing how easily our own records could become fragments. Digital decay, lost formats, forgotten contexts. Future readers may find our data perfectly preserved and entirely confusing. They will invent stories about us too. That thought should slow us down. The game between memory and trace is ongoing. Memory wants narrative. Trace offers fragments. The tension between them creates history as we experience it. When trace thins, memory gets louder. When trace thickens, memory quiets down. Late-night history prefers balance. It acknowledges that imagination is inevitable but insists on awareness. Are we interpreting evidence or soothing ourselves? Are we listening to the past or talking over it? Incomplete records do not ask to be completed. They ask to be respected. The emptiness that invites invention can also invite patience, a willingness to let silence remain silent, a recognition that not every question deserves an answer. Late-night history finds calm there, because the past does not owe us completeness. It existed without knowing we would ask. When records break, the break itself becomes part of the story. And sometimes the most honest thing we can say is that the page is missing, not because it hides something extraordinary, but because time passed and no one was responsible for keeping it intact. That quiet fact may be the hardest one to accept, and that is why we keep inventing. But we do not have to. The page that never learned to speak. Bronze Age, Central Asia, after the silence. The hook begins where the record already failed us. After the shelves cracked and the margins filled with inventions, there is a softer absence waiting further east. Not a burned library, not a conquered archive, just a page that never learned to speak in the first place. Central Asia in the Bronze Age does not feel erased, it feels unaddressed, like a letter written in architecture and metal and then left unsent. Late-night history leans into that quiet because it is different from loss. You cannot mourn what was never written. You can only stand among the remains and notice how comfortable silence can be when it does not apologize. Beyond the familiar centers of early civilization, there were societies that built without narrating themselves. No long king lists, no administrative diaries, no explanations carved into stone. Instead, there were walls rising from desert plains, fire altars arranged with care, jewelry worked with skill that suggests long apprenticeship, and then nothing. No voice following the object, no sentence attached to the tool, just presence without commentary. Late-night history finds this both unsettling and oddly respectful. These Bronze Age cultures across Central Asia occupied a wide belt of land that connected worlds. Routes ran between river valleys and steppe corridors. Materials moved, ideas moved, people moved. What did not move was writing, or at least not in a form that survived. The result is a civilization known almost entirely through what it touched rather than what it said. Archaeologists find planned settlements, fortified compounds, storage rooms that imply coordination rather than chaos, decorative motifs repeated across wide distances. metallurgy that required knowledge transfer and standardization. None of this suggests improvisation. These were societies with memory. They simply did not externalize it into text. That choice or circumstance forces us to confront an uncomfortable assumption. We often equate history with documentation. If something was important, it must have been written down. Central Asia, in the Bronze Age, challenges that habit gently but firmly. Importance does not always announce itself. Late-night history pauses here. Without texts, there are no named founders, no official beginnings, no dramatic endings. There is no moment to point to and say, this is when it started or this is when it collapsed. There's only material continuity and then absence. Settlements appear. They flourish. They empty. Not suddenly, not theatrically. They simply stop being used. This makes modern storytelling uneasy. We prefer arcs, we prefer causes, we prefer responsibility. Silence resists all three. So we speculate, we talk about climate shifts, about migrations, about trade disruption, all reasonable possibilities, none provable in full. Without written records, each explanation floats rather than anchors. Late-night history allows these ideas to pass without insisting they settle. What matters more is what the silence reveals about us. When a civilization leaves no script, we do not know how to listen. We keep waiting for language to arrive and explain the artifacts to us, but the artifacts already are the explanation. We just do not speak their dialect comfortably. Walls tell us about defense and community. Fire installations tell us about ritual and continuity of practice. Jewelry tells us about identity and status. Burials tell us about care and social memory. None of these require commentary to exist. They functioned perfectly well without future readers. Late-night history appreciates that restraint. There is also irony in how much labor went into things that were never meant to persuade posterity. The buildings were not messages. The tools were not symbols. They were solutions. And because they were not designed to be read, they resist interpretation now. This resistance invites projection. We label these societies mysterious, as if mystery were a property of the past rather than a limitation of our access. The people themselves likely experienced very little mystery about their world. They knew who they were. They knew what the structures meant. They did not need to explain it to us. Late-night history finds comfort in that. The absence of writing does not indicate simplicity. It indicates a different relationship to memory. Knowledge may have been transmitted orally, through apprenticeship, through ritual repetition, through movement across landscapes. These methods leave fewer durable traces, but they are not fragile. They persist as long as the community does. When the community dissolves, the knowledge goes with it. This is where modern anxiety creeps in. We worry about how much of our own world depends on continuous maintenance. We see ourselves in these vanished systems. We imagine expertise dissolving when networks break. We imagine skills becoming unreadable artifacts. So we search Central Asia for warnings. Late-night history does not rush to assign lessons. Instead, it notices something quieter. These societies did not fail because they lacked writing. They simply ended because circumstances changed. Writing would not have saved them. It would only have left us something to read about their ending. That is a humbling realization. Much of what we value about the past is shaped by survivability rather than significance. The cultures that speak loudest now are those whose materials endured or whose texts were copied repeatedly. Central Asia did not invest in those forms. It invested in living systems. When those systems stopped, the record stopped with them. There is a temptation to imagine that somewhere beneath the sand there are still archives waiting, wooden tablets turned to dust, symbols that once existed but did not survive. That may be true, but even if they were found, they would not restore a complete narrative. They would only add fragments. Late-night history remains comfortable with fragments. It understands that some pages never existed, that not every silence is a loss. Some are original conditions. This forces a shift in how we approach the past. Instead of asking what they believed, we ask how they lived. Instead of seeking names, we observe patterns. Instead of expecting explanations, we accept traces. The result is a history that feels less authoritative, but more honest. There is also gentle humor in how badly we want these societies to explain themselves. We imagine councils, hierarchies, ideologies, all likely existed in some form. But without evidence, we are really describing ourselves, our categories, our expectations. Late-night history smiles at that habit. Central Asia in the Bronze Age becomes a mirror. It shows us how dependent we are on narrative, how uneasy we feel when history refuses to cooperate, how quickly we replace silence with confidence. But if we slow down, something else emerges. The quiet of these sites is not empty. It is settled. The walls are not anxious. The tools are not confused. They simply are. Their meaning was complete within their moment. We arrive late and ask questions they never needed to answer. Late-night history finds a certain peace there. It suggests that history does not exist to reassure us. It does not owe us explanation. Sometimes it simply leaves behind the weight of human presence and nothing else. And that may be enough. As we move forward from broken records and invented narratives into places where writing never arrived, we are forced to recalibrate our expectations. Not every civilization wanted to be remembered. Some were content to function. The page that never learned to speak does not demand interpretation. It invites attention. Attention without ownership. Observation without conclusion. Late-night history accepts that invitation, because in the end the silence of Bronze Age Central Asia is not a failure of history. It is a reminder of its boundaries, a place where memory ends and humility begins. And in that quiet there is something steady, not a secret, not a warning, just the sound of a world that worked without needing to explain itself. Ancient remains that learned how to stay hidden, the structures that refused to explain themselves. When stone learned to stay quiet, the hook arrives softly because these places do not respond well to being rushed. Somewhere past the point where maps grow vague and timelines thin out, there are structures that remain perfectly visible and entirely uncooperative. They stand where they have always stood. They show their surfaces freely. They offer scale, texture, and weight. What they do not offer is commentary. Late-night history appreciates this restraint. It is refreshing in a world that keeps trying to explain itself louder. These ruins do not argue. They wait. And the longer you look at them, the more unsettling their calm becomes. Across deserts, hills, and forgotten plains, there are stone forms that feel deliberate without feeling communicative, walls that imply planning, platforms that suggest gathering, alignments that indicate thought. Yet nothing accompanies them, no inscription, no dedicatory plaque, no helpful hint carved into the surface. They look prepared for understanding and then quietly decline to participate. Late-night history leans closer. Modern observers often describe these sites as mysterious, but that word hides a bias. Mystery assumes intention to conceal. These structures are not hiding. They are simply not speaking our language. The silence belongs to us, not to them. Stone does not forget. It just does not summarize. Many of these constructions show clear evidence of design thinking, load distribution, repetition of form, material selection that required familiarity with environment and labor coordination. None of this happens accidentally. The thinking is visible. The reasoning is not. This distinction unsettles us. We are trained to trust explanation more than presence. A thing feels real once it is named. A structure feels understood once it is categorized. When those steps fail, we grow impatient. We invent functions. We assign meanings. We borrow metaphors from other places and lay them gently over the stone like borrowed blankets. Late-night history notices how quickly this happens. The irony is that these structures once made perfect sense. To the people who built them, they did not require explanation. Their purpose was embedded in daily practice. Their meaning was shared through use rather than description. The building itself was not a message. It was an answer. Time removed the question. When language disappears, architecture becomes ambiguous. A wall becomes symbolic. A platform becomes ceremonial. A corridor becomes a threshold. These interpretations may be correct or they may simply be satisfying. Without text, we cannot tell the difference. Late-night history resists choosing. There is a subtle arrogance in assuming that silence equals loss, that if no story survives, then something important is missing. In reality, the importance may have been so obvious that recording it felt unnecessary. We write instructions when confusion is expected. We do not annotate what everyone already knows. These builders may have trusted continuity more than preservation. Stone architecture often outlives its context. The roof collapses. The path erodes. The users vanish. The remaining structure keeps its shape, but loses its vocabulary. What remains looks like intention without narrative. That gap is where imagination rushes in. Late-night history smiles faintly at the creativity. We are excellent at telling stories on behalf of stone. We make it philosophical. We make it cosmic. We make it monumental. Sometimes we forget that it might have been practical, or local, or mundane. A platform could be for gathering grain, a wall could be a windbreak, a tower could be storage. These explanations feel disappointing, so we often skip them. We prefer mystery that flatters complexity. Yet there is complexity and restraint. Choosing not to carve stories into stone is not a failure. It is a decision, or a habit, or a worldview that valued function over memory. These societies may not have imagined an audience thousands of years later standing confused. They did not build for us. Late-night history sits with that discomfort. Without inscriptions, architecture becomes the primary language. Its grammar is spatial, its verbs are movement and light and shadow. Its punctuation is alignment and boundary. We can read some of it, but never fluently. That partial literacy makes us uneasy. We ask why these people did not write, why they did not leave names, why they did not explain themselves. These questions assume that explanation is a universal goal. It may not be. Some cultures invested knowledge in repetition rather than record, in apprenticeship rather than archive, in embodied practice rather than text. When those practices end, nothing remains to translate. Stone cannot tell you how it was used. It only shows you where it stood. Late-night history finds a quiet respect in that limitation. There is also humor in how confident we become when faced with uncertainty. A few measurements and suddenly, entire social systems are reconstructed. Diagrams appear. Labels multiply. The silence gets crowded with certainty. Late-night history does not interrupt, but it raises an eyebrow. The most honest interpretation of many of these sites is provisional. They were built with care. They served a purpose. They mattered. Beyond that, we must proceed gently. Silence is not a puzzle that demands solving. Sometimes it is simply a condition to be acknowledged. When architecture outlasts language, it reminds us that meaning is situational. What feels profound now may have been routine then. What feels unknowable may have been obvious. This reversal is unsettling because it puts us in the position of ignorance. Late-night history accepts that position. Standing among structures that refuse explanation teaches patience. It slows interpretation. It reminds us that not everything left behind was meant to instruct us. Some things were meant to work. There is dignity in that. Modern culture is obsessed with legacy, with leaving messages, with being remembered accurately. These ancient builders may not have shared that concern. Their success was measured in stability, not remembrance. The stone does not complain about being misunderstood. We do. Late-night history listens to that complaint and then lets it pass. There is also a subtle warning embedded in these silent forms. Our own buildings may outlast our records. Future observers may stand inside our infrastructure and invent stories about our intentions. They will be wrong and confident at the same time. That thought should soften our tone. The architecture that refuses to explain itself is not mocking us. It is reminding us of proportion, of scale, of how small our certainty is compared to time. These structures endured erosion, climate collapse, and abandonment. They did not endure interpretation. That is our burden. Late-night history does not rush to lift it. Instead, it stands quietly with the stone, observing, not naming, allowing presence to remain without conclusion. Because sometimes the most accurate response to the past is not an answer, it is attention. And the willingness to let silence stay intact. The structures do not need us to finish their sentences. They finished them long ago. We are the ones still learning how to listen. When machines learn to whisper, technology staring into an older silence, the hook arrives quietly because this is not a moment of revelation. It is a moment of adjustment. After stone refused to speak and structures declined to explain themselves, something new entered the room. Not a voice from the past, but a machine from the present. Cameras that see beneath soil, sensors that measure what fingers cannot feel, algorithms that sort patterns faster than thought. For a brief moment, we believed the silence might finally break. Late-night history watches this optimism carefully. It has seen this hope before. Technology does not wake the dead. It only sharpens the quiet. When modern tools turn their attention backward, they do not encounter a story waiting to be unlocked. They encounter fragments, rearranged with higher resolution. Ground-penetrating radar reveals foundations but not conversations. Chemical analysis identifies materials but not motives. Satellite imagery traces ancient roads but not the reasons people walked them. Technology expands. Sight, not memory. This is the uncomfortable truth that settles in once the excitement fades. The past does not become louder simply because we listen with better equipment. It becomes clearer in shape and equally silent in meaning. Late-night history finds a dry irony here. We built machines to overcome limitation, to see farther, dig deeper, calculate faster, and yet the most advanced tools bring us face to face with an older limitation. Absence is not a technical problem. It is a historical condition. When laser scans outline buried cities, they do not tell us who lived there. When DNA analysis tracks migration, it does not explain why people moved. When isotopes reveal diet, they do not describe taste memory or routine. These discoveries are valuable. They refine understanding, but they stop short of narrative. The silence remains intact. There is something almost tender about this boundary. Machines can measure the thickness of a wall, but they cannot tell us who leaned against it at dusk. They can detect fire residues, but not the arguments that followed. They can map roads, but not the hesitation of departure. Late-night history does not resent this. It respects it. The danger arrives when we mistake clarity for completion. High-resolution maps create an illusion of understanding. Detailed reconstructions feel authoritative. We forget that accuracy of form does not equal access to experience. This is where imagination sneaks back in, wearing technical clothing. We start to narrate again. Only now the stories sound scientific. They wear graphs and probability ranges. They speak confidently about social structure based on spatial distribution. They infer belief systems from alignment and pattern. Some of these inferences are thoughtful. Some are convenient. Late-night history listens, but does not applaud too quickly. Technology has given us sharper fragments, not fuller lives. It has cleaned the dust off ruins without restoring the voices that moved through them. The dead remain unreachable, not because we lack tools, but because they are gone. This realization is unsettling because it confronts a modern faith. We are used to problems yielding under innovation. We expect enough data to produce answers. History resists this expectation calmly. No amount of processing power can reconstruct a thought that was never recorded. There is also a quiet humility forced upon researchers who sit before screens filled with precise measurements and realize they are still guessing. The machine has done its work perfectly. The interpretation remains human and uncertain. Late-night history appreciates that moment. It is tempting to see technology as a bridge across time. In reality, it is a spotlight that reveals how wide the gap remains. The light reaches farther, but the distance does not shrink. This does not make the effort pointless. It makes it honest. When modern methods peel back layers of sediment, they expose patterns of planning, repetition, coordination. These findings tell us that past societies were thoughtful, organized, capable. That knowledge matters. It corrects old assumptions about primitiveness or randomness. But it does not replace the missing voices. The people who built those structures did not leave behind explanations because they did not anticipate an audience separated by millennia. Their silence is not a challenge, it is a consequence. Late-night history sits with this consequence. There is a certain irony in watching machines tirelessly search for intention, while the past remains indifferent. The ruins do not respond faster because we asked better questions. They remain exactly as they were. This teaches an important lesson about limits. Modern technology excels at revealing what happened. It struggles with why. Even more, it cannot touch how it felt. Emotion, routine, habit, boredom, pride, fear. These do not fossilize well, and so the quiet persists. Some researchers respond by narrowing claims, speaking in probabilities, offering scenarios rather than conclusions. This is the most responsible path. Others are less patient. They let the technology speak louder than it should. Late-night history notices the difference. There is also something deeply human in wanting technology to rescue us from uncertainty. Silence makes us uneasy. Machines feel like allies against not knowing. When they fail to deliver meaning, we feel disappointed. But the disappointment is misplaced. Technology is not a time machine. It is an amplifier. It magnifies evidence. It does not invent it. The dead do not speak because we lack microphones. They do not speak because they are gone. This is not defeat. It is reality. Late-night history finds calm in accepting that boundary. It shifts focus from extraction to attention, from solving to observing. The question changes. Not what did this mean, but what does its survival tell us about endurance, about material choice, about adaptation? Modern tools are excellent at answering those questions. They show us how cities responded to environment, how infrastructure evolved, how materials traveled, how labor was organized at scale. This knowledge reshapes understanding without pretending to replace experience. The silence remains, but it becomes contextual rather than threatening. There is also a subtle comfort in knowing that some things resist total capture, that even in an age of sensors and scans, the past retains privacy. It reminds us that history is not a data set waiting to be completed. It is a relationship marked by distance. Late-night history values that distance. It prevents arrogance. It keeps curiosity alive. It discourages final answers. When technology looks back at ancient structures, it does not awaken them. It circles them, measures them, maps them, and then stops. What remains is the same quiet that stone offered before the machines arrived. Perhaps that is the point. The silence of the past is not a flaw to be corrected. It is a feature of time, a reminder that not everything was built to explain itself to us. Modern technology does not erase that silence. It frames it. And in doing so, it teaches us something uncomfortable and necessary, that even with our brightest tools, we are visitors, that the people who lived there finished their lives without us, that the quiet we hear is not waiting for completion. It is complete already. Late-night history lowers its voice here, because when machines finally stop scanning and the screens go dark, the ruins remain unchanged. Stone still stands, absence still holds. And the past continues doing what it has always done best, remaining just out of reach. The last light stays on, silence as the final chapter. The hook arrives at the hour when certainty gets tired, when the room is dim enough that objects stop asking for attention and thoughts slow down on their own. This is usually when history behaves most honestly, not as a parade of events, but as a collection of pauses. Late-night history prefers this hour because it reveals something uncomfortable. Much of what we call knowledge exists only because silence has not yet swallowed it. And much of what we never learn is not hidden by conspiracy or destruction, but simply kept by the dark, doing its job. Silence is not a failure of history. It is one of its materials. We often treat darkness as something to overcome, as if the goal of learning were to flood every corner with light until nothing ambiguous remains. But history does not work that way. It is not a puzzle designed to be completed. It is a landscape shaped by erosion. What survives does so unevenly. What disappears does not leave forwarding addresses. Late-night history finds calm in accepting this. The idea that we might know only a small portion of the story feels unsettling at first. We prefer completeness. We prefer timelines that behave. But the more closely you look, the more you realize how thin the record really is. Pages are missing everywhere, not torn out deliberately, just never copied, never preserved, never meant to last. There is a quiet irony in how confident we become despite this. We speak about centuries as if they were rooms we had personally visited. We argue over interpretations built on fragments. We correct one another passionately over events recorded by a handful of voices who survived by chance. Silence watches patiently. The Dark Ages were never fully dark. They were simply less documented. People lived, worked, traded, argued, loved, and died with no awareness that future historians would feel anxious about their absence. Life does not pause because it is not being recorded. Late-night history lowers its voice here. There is something humbling about realizing that most of human experience left no trace strong enough to reach us. The ordinary days vanished first. The routines, the small decisions, the conversations that mattered most to the people having them. What remains are exceptions, crises, structures, objects built to endure. This creates a distorted picture. We think history is dramatic because drama survives better than normality. We think the past was defined by collapse and conquest because those moments demanded record keeping. Silence does not compete well with catastrophe. And yet silence held everything together. Night after night, generations slept without knowing they would become a gap in someone else's timeline. They did not experience themselves as missing. They experienced themselves as present. Late-night history respects that presence. The dark is not an enemy of understanding. It is a boundary. It reminds us that knowledge has edges, that memory requires material, that forgetting is not always intentional. Sometimes a book is missing pages because no one thought to protect them. This is where the gentle humor appears. We imagine history as a grand volume filled with wisdom. But in practice, it behaves more like a borrowed book that came back incomplete. Margins smudged, chapters skipped. The ending intact only because it was written last. Perhaps that is the most honest metaphor. History is not hiding answers from us. It is simply incomplete. And that incompleteness is not something to fix. It is something to acknowledge. Late night history pauses here and lets the quiet stay quiet, because once you accept that silence belongs to the story, you stop trying to conquer it. You stop filling gaps too quickly. You become more careful with claims, more patient with uncertainty. You begin to listen differently. The night does not erase meaning. It preserves proportion. It reminds us that what we know is small compared to what was lived, that the past does not exist to reassure us, that mystery is not a problem to solve but a condition to live with. There is relief in that realization. You do not have to finish the book. You only have to read what survived with care. Late night history stays with the dark because it understands something simple. Silence is not empty. It is full of everything that did not make it through. And maybe that is enough. Because the final chapter of history was never meant to explain itself. It was meant to fade quietly and let us sit with what remains.